Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew, and joining me on the line is our special guest, JP Bauer. JP is a friend of mine who I met actually while taking part in a LARP, a live-action role-playing game, and I'm really glad he can be with us today because today we're actually talking about the ethics of LARPing. So, JP, how you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. How about you?
Not too bad, not too bad. I'm really glad we could have you on because I know you and I have exchanged a lot of Facebook messages and a lot of joint rants on different Facebook posts and stuff like that, so I've been excited to have you on as a guest. And I know this is a topic you really care a lot about in terms of the ethical questions that surround role-playing games. Primarily, we're going to talk today about live action, but also about tabletop and really any ethical questions that come up anytime a group of friends or a group of people get together to play a game or do something like that. So let me just start by JP. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I have been playing role-playing games since I was a young child. 10, 12 were about when I started. And then I started live-action role-playing when I was 17. So I've been doing it for over a decade now. And
just for anyone who's not quite sure, how would you define what is LARPing? What is live-action role-playing games?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, but
Sure.
But as is any definition in the gaming world. But to put it simply, instead of playing Clue, you are standing up and usually in costume and physically acting out the voices, actions, and words of your characters.
Yeah, and I think that's essential, especially for a lot of what we're going to talk about today, because I think most of our listeners probably, if they haven't played it themselves, at least have some familiarity with, role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons or Vampire the Masquerade or Shadowrun or any of those, where you're pretending to be a character and you have stats and you roll dice to simulate, if your sword or your laser gun hits or whatever it is. LARPing is taking that to another level, I think, where there's costumes and you're acting it out, and because of that, you're getting a lot more into the character in some really great ways, but also in ways that can raise a lot of questions, both in character and in player. And I want us to make sure we cover that. But let me I interrupted you a bit. What else about yourself do you think is important for listeners to know today?
I've dabbled a bit in designing LARPing scenarios and games myself. And I also, on an amateur level, let me stress that I have no formal education in these matters, because I do think that is important to note.
No, for sure.
History, philosophy, and ethics in general are all of great interest to me.
Good stuff. Well, yeah, I think that's definitely going to inform a lot of what we talk about today. So let's actually start on the positive. What do you love about LARPing? What keeps you coming back to it?
For me personally, a lot of what interests me about live action role playing is when I'm able to embody a character, like you said earlier. I feel like I'm taking, and this is something I would probably want to talk more about later, but I feel like I am taking on new perspectives, and I'm able to experience thought patterns and perspectives that I wouldn't normally engage in, both in my mind and kind of physically, trying to physically embody them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've often thought of LARPing as kind of like what happens when you cross writing with improv theater, basically. You know, and that there's an element of when you write a character, part of what you're trying to do is say, okay, well, instead of asking myself how would I function in this situation, it's how would this character I create function in this situation. And what I love about LARPing when it's at its best, I think, is that you have 5 or 10 or 50 people who are all doing that, and now we're really all kind of writing a story together, and we're creating situations that are, okay, well, my character is going to do something different. How would your character react? And now how would my character react to what your character did? And kind of letting that ping pong ball of different situations just keep on going throughout the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think of it as an excellent thought experiments in practice is really how I think of it.
Definitely.
Now it's also just generally a good time, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it's, you and I met through LARPing, and one of the reasons I often join a LARP when I go to a new area is I know I've got a pretty good chance of meeting a lot of awesome people who think a little bit differently than the mainstream. So that the fun part of it is not to be missed. But I like that especially in terms of especially what you were saying about new situations, because I've said on other times on this podcast that one of the things I love about science fiction so much is it gives the chance to to ask questions about how would we explore a question we're already used to, but in a different world. Like the Star Trek does its classic examples of raising questions of race, except with the races flipped in some way, or Battlestar Galactica did a lot of great examples of that. I think, as I hope we're going to talk about, in both good and bad ways, LARPing can be a similar thing. It can be saying, how can we, tell stories about characters that are allowing us to kind of explore issues in our own world from different perspectives.
Yeah, that very thing is what I enjoy. I said earlier what I enjoy about playing these games when I'm actually organizing and running them, exploring those very questions and the opportunities the format of LARPing allows me to engage in is what I enjoy about running the events. So I find satisfying.
Say a little bit more about that. What kind of LARPs have you run, and how have you used that to explore questions like that? Because I don't think I've ever played in a game that you were running.
It's funny that you brought up Battlestar Galactica explicitly, because although it wasn't a science fiction game, it was a fantasy game. I did run a LARP that was focused on the same kind of themes as the newer iteration of Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, interesting.
Which playing very much on identity and who we can trust and who identifying the self. It actually ended quite poorly because, and it was a great learning experience for me. This was relatively early on in when I really started to take running the game seriously. Mm-hmm. And because of the game itself, people's home lives with each other as roommates or even romantic relationships started to break down because of the distrust that was being sown between their characters in the game.
Wow.
To such a degree that I had to stop running the game.
Wow.
It was kind of my own little Zimbardo Stanford experiment. And that's really what made me start to question what the ethics of engaging in this stuff is, because I realized that I had a responsibility to try to avoid that happening in the future.
No, I think that's a great point. And Paul, who's my normal co-host, and we didn't meet in a LARP, but he and I both participated in LARPs when we were in high school many, many years ago. And we've both seen, and both I think I could speak a little bit for him, and mostly for me, both of us experienced times where we were getting a little bit too into our characters, and the lines between, how do I feel about this player, and how does my character feel about this character? When you're not careful, those lines can, and especially when you're not in the best place mentally, those lines can get a little blurry. And I've certainly seen that as a player, and it must have been fascinating because I imagine as a storyteller, as the person running the LARP, on the one hand, there's a real point of pride that you're telling such an amazing story that people are getting so lost in it, but also that question of oh my God, what have I done, when you start to see the results of that. That's got to be a really interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah, it is a bit difficult to wrestle with, and all I just try to do is channel that ability in a more constructive direction.
How have you, in LARPs you've run since then, have you found specific things you kind of do now to try to be a little bit of a check on that, or do you think it's more just about being careful with the players?
I think it's a mixture of both. If you're designing a game, when you're designing a narrative for a game, you need to be careful of what themes and moods you're putting into it, depending on how well you know the people you're running it for. In that game that I mentioned, I only knew there was about 50 people in the game, and I only knew perhaps a dozen of them very well beforehand.
Yeah.
And because of that, I wasn't really able to anticipate reactions or how safe it was for a person, or talk to them about it very well, because, we didn't have that level of intimate trust for a conversation on that emotional level. So now I kind of am very careful about what kind of characters and antagonists I put into a narrative, because I think people engage as much as they engage with their own characters. When you're doing it well, they engage with the antagonist just as much.
Yep.
And sometimes those antagonists are other players, and sometimes they're people betrayed by me or people who are helping me out. And in any case, or in either case, it can change the perspective on the person playing that character.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think, role-playing is a chance to, to take on a different side, and sometimes it's fun to, to be a bad guy or to be an antagonist. But I know there's certainly been times where I sort of feel like, wow, I'm really good at pretending to be this asshole. I hope people know that I'm actually not this bad, and oh, wait, maybe I am this bad if I'm able to play someone this bad. I mean, it could just lead to all kinds of questions like that.
Yeah, and that's where, like, how well you know the other people you're playing with already really comes into play.
Yeah.
If you're coming into a situation where you're running a game for a bunch of people you don't know, or you're playing in a game with a bunch of people you don't know, I think it's a wise idea to not play an extremely antagonist character right away.
Definitely.
And to try to play something that you know is going to contribute to the community both in and out of character of the game.
Well, and this is, and I know it's something we'll get more into when we specifically explore characters. But I think one of the thing, again, in other parts of this podcast, we've talked about the difference between like a good antagonist who has, they might be horribly evil, but they really have a story of themselves, a reason why, they think they're their own protagonist. Versus, the kind of cardboard cutout villains you sometimes get in movies or TV shows that are just kind of mustache-twirling villains, evil for the sake of evil. And I think the same thing can apply to a LARP. I think that what often really frustrates me in a LARP is when I see someone playing, they just want to be an asshole, or they just want to be wild and crazy, or they just want to be whatever. And it seems like the player is just kind of having fun annoying other players instead of really, playing a well-thought-out character who, for whatever character reasons, might not be the easiest to be around.
Yeah, I have some specific things to say on that topic for sure, but
sure,
we should get into that a little bit later.
That's me baiting the hook a little bit too much. My apologies there. But so let's then start with talking about just other things that can make a LARP problematic. And I was actually thinking of this mostly as a player, but I'm really glad you brought in as a storyteller as well. But look, I want to start, if you don't mind, because I know this is a topic you've talked about some, and I don't want us to spend too long on it, but I know you have written about recently deciding not to take part in one of the larger publishers of LARPing materials, White Wolf, their games Vampire the Masquerade and Werewolf, etc. And I really appreciated reading what you said and made a similar decision myself. And so I was kind of wondering if you could talk for just a few minutes about what made you make that decision.
Yeah, so first of all, this is on its face even more complicated than it appears, because even when we talk about White Wolf as a publisher over the last decade, they were one of the first publishers of, certainly one of the first successful publishers of any role-playing game, going back to the early 90s, late 80s. And in the last decade, they've gone through several iterations, and the original intellectual property has been divvied up to this group and that group and this group. Now, there's still one company that owns all of it and profits from it now, but who's actually in charge and how much each of those groups profit from the intellectual property varies widely, and in as many cases unclear due to perfectly reasonable legal reasons. So it becomes very muddled in the question of what company I'm supporting or not. But I just wanted to get that out of the way right away, because... Of course,
yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, I think my goal with asking you to talk about this now here isn't even as much to get into the nitty-gritty of that specific company, as much as I just think it's really interesting the way you've made a decision to not play a certain set of games based on the decisions of one of the companies that's very involved.
Sure. So to wrap it up, to summarize what happened with the company, recently they changed hands. The intellectual, who actually owns the intellectual property as a whole, changed hands again, and they are becoming engaged in publishing material for those games again. And in the process, instead of like renting out their intellectual property as has been done for a while now, in the process they've hired several people who I would say have very questionable ethics of their own. Now, I don't want to get too much into why I think that on the podcast here, but
definitely.
because, as you said, the point is more, why did I come to my decision to stop playing? It's because those people, I don't want to be helping those people engage in unethical actions. And by supporting them both financially by buying the products and in a more esoteric way by engaging with the ideas they're producing and encouraging other people to take on those ideas and themselves buy those products. I can't add up how I can get away with doing that in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that in a lot of ways it feels to me like, as someone who's done a lot of political activism, this is a boycott. This is something where you look at, I think about, companies that, like Chick-fil-A and Wendy's that, where people have said, or like the writings of Orson Scott Card, where people have said, like, look, I look at the people who are behind these products or these intellectual products or physical products, and these are people really doing terrible things, and I don't want to support them, and so I'm going to choose not to engage in them. Do you think, is that a fair comparison to make? Calling this?
I do, although I do want to observe that I think it's a bit different, because when you're playing these games, and especially when you're running these games, you're not just like absorbing, you're not just taking in what the other person has produced. You're taking it and using it yourself.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, it's like saying, I don't want to use these tools that this person has created, which I think is a little different than saying I don't want to take in the media they've created.
Right. Well, and I remember I in one of the discussions about this, there was a really good point that I think you made, which was, because I remember one of the suggestions someone else was talking about was, can you just play the games, but like if people have already purchased the material, can you play the game only using those material or using electronic copies of the material that are distributed? In other words, sort of not putting any more money than has already been spent into their coffers. And the point that I think you had made that I thought was a really powerful one about LARPing was that any time people get together to LARP, even if they're only using it, the new player who comes in, you're still getting them excited about this particular game and thus the material, and thus maybe making them want to go buy the game themselves. And so even if you're not doing it, like, you're basically sort of, in some ways, every time we play the game, it's free advertising for the products.
Absolutely. Exactly how I put it. When you're running or playing in a game, or even telling other people your stories about that game, you are advertising. And that's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. That's a natural human thing to do. But I think we do have a responsibility to ask ourselves, is it ethical for me to advertise for this? Who's benefiting from my advertisement?
No, and I think it's I was really struck by this discussion in part because it's one that I've had often about a number of different gaming materials, but I've primarily in my own LARPing life engaged with the White Wolf materials, and I'll have to admit there always were times where some of the works I loved, and then there were some properties that I thought were, in books that are trying to write about different groups, often of different racial or ethnic backgrounds, can sometimes be deeply problematic. I mean, in White Wolf circles, anyone who has ever read anything by White Wolf knows if I mention the Gypsy book, it's often regarded as a very racist piece of material. But I think it's not only linked to White Wolf. I know until fairly recently, Dungeons and Dragons was pretty bad about having, almost all white characters portrayed in its books. They're now getting a lot better and moving in those ways. But in some ways, kind of like the questions that you were raising has made me think about this in larger terms. In terms of like how do we think about the logical, ethical questions that these books are promulgating? When they are writing about either directly or situations that are as clear metaphors supposed to be referencing racial or gender or sexuality issues in our own world.
Role-playing games are really, I think, the hotbed of exactly these topics these days. Mm-hmm. I'm close with a number of role-playing game designers, and they all have very different opinions on how much this should be included.
Yeah.
And I think there is huge opportunity, specifically because of how role-playing works, to make a positive difference in the world. I think when people are exploring different perspectives, as we discussed earlier, they are increasing their ability to empathize and understand other people.
Yeah.
And there are several different directions you can take that, and some of them are destructive and some of them are constructive. So I feel very strongly that it's important to call on designers of these games to understand that they're not just making a game, they are making a statement about our society.
And do you have any particular examples you know of either as a storyteller or as a player where you've seen that kind of thing of another player had their perspective shift somewhat? I definitely can think of one or two, and I'm curious if you know of if you have ones you would like to share about where you've seen someone develop more of that kind of empathy.
Oh, certainly. I'm just pausing a moment to go through my catalog.
So no, of course.
I'll speak about this in the general and then the specific.
Sure.
One thing that I think is very interesting in role-playing games especially is, and video games to a certain degree, is the decline of Orientalism. In the past, there was a huge tendency in these communities to mystify and
I'd say almost even fetishize.
Yeah, fetishize Eastern cultures, Chinese, Japanese, any of them, or just the general aesthetics of Asian cultures. In recent years, I've seen a huge shift in that towards much more responsible portrayals of that material, and I've watched players who, when we all started out as teenagers, would play very, what would now be very offensive caricatures as characters, to realize, like, through playing those caricatures and then looking back on how they acted in the past, and then trying to portray a more nuanced version of that character today. I've watched people's understanding and ability of how they should portray other cultures change, just like that.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful example, especially because the that sort of, as I said, fetishization or approach towards, what's often referred to as kind of the mystical East, and I say that with great quotation marks because that's the whole problem. I've seen that in so many role-playing games and video games where, the Eastern martial art character is just put on such a pedestal because of the portrayal of that sort of thing. And I don't know, for myself, the time when I've seen it is especially around issues of masculinity. And I'm saying I'm shifting a little bit from the Orientalism question to a different example. But for one, myself, I've seen, there's one example in particular I can think of, a game that was played in a D&D type setting, but one that the storyteller had adjusted a good deal. It was one I played while we were in grad school. And there was a person in our friend group who was kind of he meant well, but he definitely had a lot of sort of hyper masculinity traits and would make jokes that we sort of would try to call him on a little bit, but he didn't quite understand what the problem was. And he wound up playing a character who, over the course of the game, had, a number of, who started off as a very physicalized character, and over the course of the game had, both through injury and through magic, lost the ability to use a lot of his sort of physical traits. And he and I and one other player would often go out for a drink after game sessions, and wound up having some really powerful conversations where he talked about how, the word he would use, and I understand why, is emasculating it felt to him to not have this physical prowess as his character. And it allowed us to have some really good conversations where he had some real breakthroughs about, why did he so link physical power and masculinity in his head? And why in his mind could you not be a male character or player who didn't have that kind of physical power? And I think it's kind of an extreme example, but it really has always stayed with me of a time when, when LARPing or role, in this case it was a tabletop game, but when those things are used in a good way, they really can help people see the world in different ways.
Yeah, that's exactly it. What a powerful example. Thank you for sharing that with me as well. That's exactly the sort of opportunity that's the power of narrative in the human mind.
Right.
And of course, everyone's different and everyone's going to engage in different materials, but there's a lot of people who can be deeply affected by these kinds of stories by engaging in narrative in this way. And and it's a responsibility and it's an opportunity.
Right. Well, and so what do you? I hate the term devil's advocate, but here I want to at least push back a little in the other direction, because I think it's a comment I often hear raised is, especially with both video games and with role-playing games, I do hear the comment, and with science fiction, honestly, or fantasy a lot, that people who want they want escapism. And I think you and I could both go round in circles and quickly argue that anybody who is, who's just saying it from the perspective of, oh, why do we always have to talk politics? Can't I just have escapism? That there's a lot of privilege in that perspective. But I'm almost even talking about someone on the other end, someone who, because I have heard this from people who say, listen, I spend my day, arguing and talking about privilege and social justice and gender and race and orientation and gender identity and all that. Can't I just have a game that lets me escape for a couple hours? Because as you said, that part of these games is to have fun. So where is the role of escapism, and how do we balance, a desire that isn't necessarily coming from a place of privilege, but a desire for escapism? How do we balance that with the social good these things can do?
Well, honestly, in my opinion, escapism is a very convenient fiction, and it's just not possible. Even if you do achieve your goal, so to speak, of completely divorcing your association with what's going on in your life while you're playing or with the world, on a subconscious level, you're still bringing in any emotions that you had throughout the day, any biases, and I think it's far healthier to use role-playing to engage with those things than to try to move away from them. A lot of people in my life who aren't involved in any kind of nerd culture, who aren't gamers, or great readers of science fiction or fantasy, they assume that a lot of what I'm doing is escapism. I remember a lot, especially when I was younger, trying to get it so that my friends could play in the games I was running, and their parents and their families very much disagreeing because they felt that they were just running away from life instead of engaging with reality.
Oh, wow.
And I just really think it is exactly the opposite. No matter what you do, you're going to be, and it sounds perhaps a little hopeless or cynical to say, we exist in this reality, even when we're pretending to be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think that sounds cynical at all. I mean, maybe I'm just because I'm cynical as well, but I think that's completely true.
And we're all trapped here with each other, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of what's the value of how do we figure this out? And I like that because there's a comic that was going around a while ago. I don't know if you ever saw it, but it was a portrayal of a person, and I thought it was interesting that it was clearly a young white, apparently cisgendered male. Sort of that he's walking through the world and there's all these problems and people are yelling at him about like ethics and politics and it's portrayed as though just everyone around him is yelling and he's outside of it but just being harried by it, and he sees the door into fandom where a Muppet and a Doctor Who character and all these others are like saying, come in here and you can escape. Have you seen the one I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay. And I always thought I get the concept of that because I get how hard it can be, and there's an extent to it, but I guess to me, I do feel like I guess I see it a little differently than you, but I think from a similar perspective is that I do, to me, the closest I come to escapism isn't wanting to run away from the problem entirely. It's about wanting to approach it from a different direction. It's about like saying, instead of just having yet another conversation with someone about can we impeach the president, it's let's go back and look at the episodes where Superman had to deal with Lex Luthor and see what lessons we can draw for the current situation. Because it's not escapism, but it's also maybe it's the escape from the one particular perspective of the problem. Because I think you're right. I think that it seems wrong to say that we can't ever be escaping, but we can maybe be using these things to approach them from a different angle.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there is a value in sort of trying to just entertain ourselves, just to distract ourselves. There is absolutely a value in that. Everyone needs respite and breaks. But I just think that those games and those pieces of fiction should be explicitly marked out that way. And with games, it needs to be... It's really hard to design a game that way just because everybody's bringing it. There's social activity with other people.
Right.
And so, even if you're very close with someone, you don't know who the person across the room or across the table from you don't know what perspectives they're bringing in all the time, what happened to them throughout their day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's so easy to stumble in, like it's almost impossible to maintain that escapism because it's so easy to just stumble into something that connects with someone. That's the whole point of the metaphor.
Right. What is total escapism for me might be going right to the heart of your trauma, and vice versa.
Right.
No, I think that's a great point. Well, and so building on that, I want to go deeper into what are some of the other things that can make a LARP problematic as a player. And let's just talk about the other players we're playing with. I know I think you posted about, but I'm sure we both have read the Missing Stair article that talks about the missing stair in applied to LARPing world. And help me out here, but my memory is that the missing stair theory is where you talk about, like, that if there's a house that has, everyone just says, oh, just be careful of that stair on the third stairwell. And no one ever thinks to fix it. They always just think, just warn people about it. And that this article was saying that in LARPing culture, there often is a similar thing of there can be a person or people who are problematic, just because they're kind of bullies, or they're bringing in a lot of aspects of racism or hypermasculinity or homophobia or whatever. And for whatever reason, the response of the community is to say, oh, that's just our missing stair, oh, you just gotta, be aware of that player. He's a little bit obnoxious. We just all deal with it. Instead of, as a community, saying, let's take action. Let's try to better educate this person. Let's set some firmer boundaries, or let's just say this person isn't welcome in our game. So I was kind of curious, what is your take on this issue of LARPing, and have you experienced it much, and kind of how have you responded?
I've experienced it in almost every game I've been in. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is because, as I just mentioned, these are social experiences by definition. There are very, very, very few role-playing games that you could play by yourself,
right,
as one person. And also, it is difficult because you are relying on all of those other people to create the media that you are consuming and creating it yourself. Being the creator and the consumer at the same time it's just a very different form of than any other sort of media that I can think of or have ever experienced. It's not like television or a book where you're taking it in. You have to simultaneously push out and take in. Mm-hmm. So because of that, people tend to form very strong bonds, and the communities, everyone knows each other better and better all the time, because as you're showing other people different characters, different situations, and you are showing them portions of yourself. And in that way, I'm sorry, I'm getting away from the missing stair a bit.
No, but it's okay. I think this is all very relevant.
Because the communities are so strong, and because everyone knows each other so intimately, especially when new people come in, it takes some time and it can be very intimidating for new people, I know. Mm-hmm. Even if you're an experienced player, coming into a new community is a completely different situation, and can be very intimidating no matter how long you've been playing. And part of that is learning where the missing stairs are.
Right.
And I think it's unfortunate that this is such a common problem. Like I said, every LARPing community and many other subcultures communities that I've been a part of. But especially in role-playing, because I think role-playing explicitly gives us the tools to deal with this problem in a constructive way.
Well, and actually, let me back up a second, because I do want us to be a little more explicit. Like, when we talk about the missing stairs, the problematic people we see in the LARPing world, like what are the kind of things we're talking about?
I mean, bluntly and most commonly, what I've seen is just like usually men, but not always, who engage in sexual abuse of other players. It's very easy for someone who has a manipulative ability to take advantage of LARP communities, new players, or other players, and for people to conflate ability to play the game and portray characters well with a strong ethical center.
Yeah, no, I think I really appreciate the way you said that, because I think that perfectly names the problem that you get seen, and you know that I've seen that play out in everything from kind of the most basic of where it's just issues of harassment and people being made uncomfortable, to issues of people. I mean, I've seen some very healthy romances form as part of LARPs, but I've also seen situations where a player started dating another player in situations that felt less than fully consensual, in part because of the dynamics playing out between their characters. And I think it is, and again, that gets into a lot of the issues of character-player bleed that we talked about, and but I think it's really important just to name that, as well as to name, and we'll get more into this in a second, but just that I've certainly also been in LARPs where you always, that person who they always find a way to play a character who gives them an excuse to express, un-PC, this is their language, but, the un-PC perspective, the character who has because it's what their character would do, that they say the N-word or things like that. And I think it's really important to, the next thing I want to get into is how we draw those lines about what is just not acceptable behavior in any character, let alone player. But I think it also is important to name for this missing stair thing. But to get back to where we were going a minute before, what do you think are the ways in which how can role-playing communities deal with this, other than just saying, oh, that's just so-and-so, we just deal with him?
First, you have to realize that you are not just a game, that you are a community.
Yep.
That's the first step. The second step is you have to really decide whether you, some games are open to anyone. Anyone who comes to the door can play that day or night even. And some games are a little more, invitation only, or a little more insular, like you can come and watch, but you gotta go through a process to actually join the game. I think those are both perfectly legitimate ways to play. It's just they both require a different approach to this problem. When you have an open door policy in your game, you have to realize that there are going to be dangerous people who will try to participate in your game, almost certainly. Of course, it depends somewhat on, do you have a lot of potential gamers in your area?
Yep.
I grew up LARPing in small towns, very small towns. My next door neighbors were Amish growing up. So
I was LARPing in New York City, so we had fairly divergent experiences there.
But even then, or perhaps even especially then, it was very easy for people to take advantage of the community. So the answer to this question is two different ways. I think that putting some barrier to entry into your game is important.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be a super high wall or something or anything, but at least when I run games personally, my preference is like, if somebody's going to join the game, that I am able to meet them outside the game, get to know them a little bit at least,
right.
And before I let them play. I think like vetting people is important. Talk to other people who know them. Now, all these things are going to have exceptions. Like I just moved to a new area. A lot of people, I don't know a lot of people in the area. So if somebody asked me, is there anybody around here that I can talk to that knows you? I wouldn't have a very good answer for that.
Right.
But there are ways to work around that. I just think asking yourself when you go to run a game or if you're organizing a game, these questions is important. How are you going to protect your players from dangerous elements that want to join the game?
Right. So that was the first, and what was the second?
That's going to vary a bit depending on what kind. There are several different varieties, again, of live action role playing, generally divided right now in the parlance between boffer, which tend to be a little more light on the actual role playing and a little bit more on the physical fighting, although that can vary.
But Parlor, again, for the folks who aren't LARPers themselves, Parlor, which I think you're about to talk about, is more like the tabletop where, if one character is trying to hit another character, you use some kind of a random element to decide if you would hit or not. You don't actually do the physical action. In Boffer, you actually literally have they're very well designed, but they're basically like foam Nerf swords, and you try to actually physically represent doing fighting, but just in a safe way without actually harming people.
And then more recently, there's also kind of a third variety, which is generally known as Nordic, because it's coming generally from Scandinavia, and that's where instead of having some sort of game mechanic like rock, paper, scissors, or dice or whatever, you just have a lot of very strong negotiation techniques, and that can either lead to people physically engaging each other more because they've already planned out in sort of a choreography way what's going to happen, or it's just a very out loud narrative description of what occurs.
Right.
And the reason I bring up these differences is because they are all introduced. I have the most experience with Parlor, but I've also engaged in the other types, and they all have their own challenges. But what they have in common is, again, the people organizing the game need to realize their responsibility and be able to delegate that responsibility to the players, because trust me, whether your game has 10 people in it or 100, you're not going to be able to see everything that happens.
Yeah.
So the best way, I think, to be a little more specific, run workshops to train your player and come up and learn techniques to allow players to check in with each other and to communicate each other without disrupting the flow of the game.
Yeah, I think that is so essential. And I recently got back into LARPing. That's how you and I met. I hadn't done it for about 8 years before then, or with a couple breaks in the last couple of years. But in those LARPs that I got into most recently, there were people who were explicitly set up to be player advocates who, if you had a concern and you didn't feel comfortable going to the people running the game, you could go to the player advocate and they would help, be an advocate for you. And they explicitly mentioned the sort of problematic player, or problematic storyteller, because let's be honest, sometimes it is the storyteller, the person running the game, who's abusing that power in either known or even unknown ways. That I thought that was such a great thing, both to have that safe way that people could go to advocate for themselves, but also just because it's such a powerful reminder of, hey guys, if you're uncomfortable, it is so important to us that you be able to talk about it, that we're creating this system just for that, Because I think what can often happen with that kind of missing stare is, because the worst thing about the missing stare is when people aren't talking about it. And so the one person who experiences a real problem with someone, because they don't hear anyone else have the problem, they're thinking, oh, everyone else must think this person is fine. I must be the only one who has a problem with it. There must be something wrong with me. And I've certainly experienced communities where 8, 10, a dozen people are all thinking, I'm the only one who thinks they have a problem. So yeah, I just think that kind of, like you said, the workshops, the explicit things, getting players talking about this becomes so important.
Yeah, and, I'm certainly not saying, remove people from your community based on hearsay. But I am saying, well, talk to each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that there has to be some middle ground between that person's totally fine and kick that person out. And it can be really just a middle ground of, can we discuss this? Because I think a lot of times, and I think this is kind of funny because this is the whole point of the storytelling, is getting into these ideas of, that concept, or at least for me, one of the things I love about LARPing is that it helps me I like playing characters who really push the boundaries of what is good and what is evil, and really get into ideas of that someone that is good in their eyes might be evil in someone else's, and vice versa, that it's all perspective on some level. And if there's a way we can take that lesson explicitly into the LARPing community, I think it can often be remember, sometimes the person who's acting in problematic ways may not realize what they're doing, is harmful to others, or they may. But at least starting with a conversation about it can really help to to bring the issues out into the open and to talk about them and see if there's a way to resolve them.
I agree. Sometimes, though, decisive action does need to be taken. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and let me ask you on that regard, on as the player. Well, actually, let me ask you on both. So, as a storyteller, as the person running the game, how do you decide when have you ever had to kick somebody out of a game?
Certainly.
So, what makes you decide that's the line we've come to mix metaphors terribly?
Essentially, if they're not willing or able to recognize that their behavior is an issue in the community. Mm-hmm. If they can't even, see why that might be a problem, if they're not willing to compromise, then they don't have to play. And I think that goes both ways too. I know that you're going to want me to say as a player too, what do you do when there's people in the game and that you don't want to engage with?
Right.
That's a really hard question to answer because, as we've said, these games are not just games, but communities, and you don't want to have to ostracize yourself from a community because of one or a handful of destructive people. You might be very fond of every other part of the community.
Especially because we're talking about, this isn't the metaculture. This is a subculture of a subculture of,
yep.
And it's certainly in New York, if I wanted to step away from the one big LARP, it wasn't always easy to find another, and I imagine that's much more so in smaller communities.
Mm-hmm, exactly. There's a multitude of things you can do. You can try to work it out with the people who are running the game and the other people in the game that, you don't have to interact with that person, but that can be very challenging, because it makes it a lot more difficult to construct narratives within the game, both for you and for the people running it. Mm-hmm. You can also utilize, if you are fortunate enough to have a game that utilizes a player advocate or some sort of player mediation, you can try to use that if you can use that person as a go-between, and just kind of set down clear boundaries. And as long as those boundaries aren't being crossed, of course, there shouldn't be a problem. The issue is that so often those boundaries are going to be crossed again, right, even after people are very clear. And what do you do then? Well, generally that means that either you have to stop playing or you have to accept that those boundaries are going to be crossed. And it's just the unfortunate reality of living in a community with other humans.
Yeah.
Well, and it's unfortunate that we have to victimize ourselves in that way and ostracize ourselves from communities sometimes, but it's just the reality of how human culture works.
Well, and it's definitely a case where I think harm reduction is really the model I look at things through. In terms of that's a situation where there is no good option. And so it's really a question of, is it going to be worse for yourself to be out of that community or to be a part of a community that has some obviously very toxic elements? And I know for me, when I've faced things like that, the biggest question often becomes that I think it's very easy to see it as a me against everyone thing. And that's when it becomes so important for me to try and reach out and find if there are other people who are bothered by this situation. Because often, if I can find at least a couple of allies like that who all, can really say, listen, we are not going to stay in this game unless the game changes, then either A, you're now speaking with a lot more power, and hopefully, I hate to use this kind of language, but it's more of a threat to the game of like, you have to change or we're going to walk. And if still that doesn't work, if you do walk, you've now created a smaller, but still, there's now a new community being created of people who share that value with you and who hopefully you can create something new with. And again, that the math there is a little bit idealized, but I think that there's some possibility there at least.
Yeah, and I want to kind of interject with something on this topic about that there is, and I think it's important that we recognize there's a difference between sharing and gossiping.
Yes. And
gossip can be very destructive.
Yep.
And sharing, the line between the two can sometimes be blurred. But for me, I think the key difference is when you're sharing and communicating, you're talking about what you have experienced and how it's affected you. And when you're gossiping, you're talking about second, third, fourth hand what has happened or occurred with other people.
Right.
And, in certain situations, it's acceptable to, engage in that sort of second, third, fourth hand discussion. But it isn't acceptable to then bring that to the community as a whole as like...
this is gospel truth when I've heard it third hand.
Right, exactly.
No, and I think that's really important. Because I think it's also important for us to remember, like, I'm someone who is a proud geek who loves LARPing, and yes, wasn't the most popular kid in high school, and there's a definite correlation between those two, and that in a lot of ways I can sort of idealize geek culture and nerd culture and LARPing culture as opposed to the sort of, uber cultures that I tend to avoid. And I think it's easy to forget that geek cultures, that LARPing cultures can sometimes be just as cliquish, can sometimes have just as much, personality stuff, where if it's one particular person saying, I'm concerned about these people, other people are going to listen to that just because that person has the strong personality in the group. These same dynamics can occur in any community, including ours. So that's a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I do want to shift a little to talking about the questions that come up when we are in character. We're going to get into some of the stuff about how we choose what characters to play and what's wrong there. I wanted to start by saying I know, when you and I interacted in LARP, we were playing characters on very different sides of the ethical spectrum. Ones that I would personally, as an upright character, have seen yours in a somewhat negative light. But I'd be curious to talk about, like, what, from your perspective, what do you enjoy out of playing characters who have an ethical system that is different than the mainstream, shall we say? And sort of what that experience is like for you. Because I haven't seen it much, but certainly from my experience with you, it certainly seems like you tend to play characters who have a strong ethical system of their own, even if it's not one that other people would recognize.
Yes, absolutely. I think that if there's any uniting trend at this point between my characters, it's simply that they have some sort of set of beliefs that they hold closely to themselves that guides their behavior. And, that is what I enjoy to do when I'm playing in a game, is to, like I said earlier, very much focus in on being able to explore a perspective that's very different from my own. In my life, I'm a very hedonistic, but a very moderation to all things except in moderation kind of person. So I have enjoyed playing characters who are extremely, extremely hidebound. And on the vice versa, I've enjoyed playing characters who allow me to explore the dangers of taking some of the ethics that I hold to more extreme levels.
Right.
So those are both very different opportunities for a person to explore when they're thinking about the ethics of the character they want to portray.
Yeah, and I think that's so essential because, as I've said before, this is obviously a real hobby horse of mine. I think in any kind of writing, both in LARPing or in movies or TV shows, but especially in LARPing, I'm really bothered by the character who's just being evil for the sake of evil or obnoxious for the sake of obnoxiousness. I think it is so important. I have certainly played some characters who were on all ends of the ethical spectrum, but it always feels so important to me to be able to feel like whatever action I'm doing, even if everyone in the room thinks it's terrible, there has to be some reason why this character thinks that it's the right thing to do. And what I tend to love about LARPing is those situations where that's the question I'm always asking is, okay, in this situation, not what would Matthew think is the right thing to do, not what would the community think is the right thing to do, but what would this character do in this situation? Because for me, that is such a source of empathy, of really being able to, if nothing else, of being able to remember that almost everybody, with marked exceptions, but for most people, they do think they are the protagonist in their story. And there's a reason why people are doing those things, even if those reasons come, from very problematic places or with very problematic results.
Absolutely. But to touch on something you brought up a couple times during our discussion here,
yep.
We still have a responsibility as authors.
Mm-hmm.
We still are making the choice. In the end, it is us making the choice, not the character.
Yeah. Well,
what's going to happen, what we're going to say, how we're going to do it.
Well, this is how communal works, because now you're making my transitions for me, which is great. But because, yeah, that's exactly the next big and probably the last big question I want us to touch on, because I think it is so important, is because obviously that, you know, like I could write in my head a character who would, you know, walk into the game with a Confederate flag on his back and make homophobic and sexist and racist comments all night long. I could write that character. I'm not going to. Because I think that's deeply irresponsible. That's going to be triggering or offensive or just really problematic for other players. So for you, what are those lines, and what is the importance for you in having those lines, not just in the characters you play, but the characters you're comfortable with other people playing?
First of all, it again comes down to me for how well the people in the community know each other and how well I know.
Yeah.
There are going to be some games where I would feel comfortable portraying that character because you know it's a handful of people or a dozen people that I know very well,
right.
And they know but there would also have to be some sort of methodology in place to stop me if somebody was starting to be affected too deeply by that sort of point. So, you know, the more tools a game has to deal with that sort of thing, to deal with a character who can be difficult for other people to deal with due to what's happened in their own lives, the more opportunity there is to explore those concepts.
You know, I did something recently when starting a tabletop game, and I wonder if you've ever done something like this, because I was really happy with how it turned out. I don't know how easily I could do it with a LARP, but it'd be interesting exploring that. Is I asked everybody, and I gave them a chance to tell me privately, but it was a tabletop game. We're going to have 5 players, and I asked each of them individually, are there any topics that you would really like to make sure don't get explored, that don't come up in the game? You know, like sexual violence or meeting a character whose mother has just died, you know, or you know, things like that. Like what are topics that are just too sensitive for you or too, you know, close to trauma you're dealing with or have dealt with that you want to make sure doesn't come up? And I think, you know, that can be limiting if it's too broad, but I found it a really helpful thing to be able to say to myself as a storyteller, okay, in my player group, this particular issue is just not right to explore, so we're going to explore something different. Have you had experience with that kind of thing, or with you know, directly asking players like what are or are not topics you're comfortable exploring?
Absolutely, and I think it's a great idea in almost every game to try and do that or something like it, something along those lines.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea, not just because you, as I just said, not just because you are learning, just not to set down those boundaries, but so that you know how far you can go.
Right.
It allows you. A lot of people who like to play these kinds of characters see those boundaries as limiting. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the opposite. I think I feel when I know exactly what the people I'm playing with are and aren't comfortable, I know exactly where I can go. I know what buttons I can push on myself and on them.
Right.
And I know it's like, you know, giving consent frees people. It doesn't bind them.
Yeah. No, I've often talked about that. I want someone to define the walls of the sandbox for me, you know, because if I know I can't go to 7, that tells me I can go to 6.8, you know? But I also think what's really important there is what you said earlier about having the mechanism in place, because I think one thing that's very important is you can have all the ideas you think about what you are or are not going to be comfortable with. But that's very different than discovering you're not comfortable with it in the moment. And I think in any game there has to be that possibility to be able to say, you know what, I thought I'd be okay exploring this particular topic, but we've gotten there and it's really bothering me. Is there some way we can, without disrupting the game, sort of gently shift into a different thing? You know, and that might not always be possible, or might be easily possible, but I think that, because I would never want a situation where, you know, players are saying to themselves, well, 2 months ago I thought I'd be okay with this topic, so now I'm stuck with it.
Right. And every gaming community is going to have a different desire for what shape those tools take, and there are plenty of articles and ideas out there if you're looking for those. And I would just urge people not to go without those tools. That's really just what I want to say. Don't think that you can get on with just talking. It's useful to have codified structures in your community and in your game on how to take care of each other.
Definitely. And I think one thing we'll do is I know of some of them, but JP, if you would send me links to some of your favorite articles about stuff like that, I will post them in the show notes when this episode goes up, so that people can easily find them. And I also just want to, I don't know if you have anything more to say on this because we may have covered it somewhat, but I also just want to reiterate, at least one of my experiences has been that often one of the most problematic players is the player who is just, he's the person who in another part of your life is always complaining about privilege and PC language and things like this, and he wants to just be able to, because often it is a he, but not always, but be able to say whatever he thinks and whatever he feels. And so this then becomes the player who is actively looking for ways to play characters who can be as offensive or as sexist or as racist as they want to be. And I really want to just say to empower players and storytellers and game runners that you're not at all like harming the integrity of a game by saying to that person, this is not okay. And that at least to my mind, the purpose of a game shouldn't be to give a person a chance to hurt other people. Because that's not what this is supposed to be about. And I think you can still have great integrity to your story, without allowing that person who's just doing it for those kind of reasons.
Yeah, and, to a certain degree, I think it could be possible to have that sort of behavior in a game and have it be healthy for that person in the game. But it's going to be very rare and very specific. And just saying to the person, this isn't the place for that, this isn't the game for that,
right, can
go a long way. Especially if you approach them from, it's going to depend on the person, of course, but if you're able to approach them from the position of empathy, the position of, making sure they know that you want them to participate, but they need to acknowledge that that they're a part of the community and that they're harming themselves and the community by behaving like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that's also a case where it is often good to figure out who is the best person to make that approach. Because I know there are some issues on which I would be able to definitely be the person to approach another player. I know, as you can tell, this particular thing I've brought up a couple times now is one that really bothers me, and probably where I would have trouble having empathy for that player. And so I would need to find someone else to say, hey, can you be the one to approach this player? Because I'm not sure if I can have that empathy. But the advantage
of community is delegation.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think exactly you're right. Say more about what you mean with delegation there.
I mean, as I kind of touched on earlier, not just as a game runner, but as a player, being able to communicate your issues to other people and have them kind of carry the torch for you when you're not able to, is the reason why humans form communities.
Yeah. No, it's really true. It's I can't paint very well, so I will grow a little bit more farming. I will do a little bit more farming in the hope that someone else can paint and create art for both of us. I think that's what society is all about. Well, and that actually lets me hit on one point I hadn't thought of, but I want to just sort of raise as a last quick topic before we've been about an hour, so I want to wrap up.
Sure.
But it's the nature of hierarchy, because I think one of the ways in which, oppression most often hits in our world, and that, as you and I both are committed to talking about social justice, we're often talking about the problems of hierarchy and power dynamics in oppressive situations. And I really like that we're talking about ways that LARPs can be communal and can be, communities can work things out. But there obviously is some kind of power structure in a LARP. There are, both as players, there's the person who's running the game and thus is setting the rules, and the players who are following the rules. And then often in the worlds we're creating, there's a power hierarchy often among the characters. And so I'd be kind of curious your thoughts on what are the ways in which breaking down or just being able to reimagine those hierarchies, both as players and as characters, can suits you for the approaches you have about hierarchies in general.
The question you're asking is something that a lot of role-playing game designers are asking themselves right now. we have to remember this is, a fairly young hobby, art form, what have you.
Yeah.
30, 40 years. Now there's some records a bit older than that, and of course there are similar behaviors throughout human history, but this specific form of it is fairly new. We're still learning a lot of the techniques to engage in this kind of play. So how to design the hierarchy of a game, like the structure of who's running it, who controls the narrative is usually the central question.
Right.
And to some degree, all role-playing games are negotiation. They're all like any sort of betting game where you're always pushing and pulling to try to suss out how much of the narrative that you're controlling at any given time. There are lots of different ways you can set up the organization of a game. I have participated in games that did not have a central person running it. It just had very clear guidelines for what the setting and rules were and how players could adjudicate any discrepancies among each other.
Right.
I have participated in games that had, and ran games that had a very rigid structure. What I say goes, and that's the understanding. I think the important thing is that it is clearly communicated before people join the game.
What the hierarchy is and how it's going to be enforced, yeah.
People, not every game is going to be for every person, and I think that's a good thing. Let's us have a variety of different situations, and let's us create homes for anyone to come to. Mm-hmm. But it has to be clearly stated what you're trying to create, what your community is trying to create.
Yeah, I think that's super important, especially just that idea of because in a lot of ways I feel like the biggest problems with a lot of hierarchies isn't the hierarchy itself, it's the unspoken, unacknowledged hierarchy. And that's obviously such an important part of race or class, privilege discussions. But I'm sure this is true for you, I have been in LARPing groups where we have played 4 or 5 or 6 different games over the course of a couple of years, and for, purely coincidence, the same players almost always wind up in the positions of power. That their characters wind up in the positions of power in the game. And it's just because it's not spoken, it's not talked about, but just whether it's because of social power or connections or whatever, those wind up being the players who take those roles. And sometimes just having a clear acknowledgement of what is the hierarchy going on, how are the rules can be enforced, both in character and out of character, can just do so much to help people feel more comfortable, as well as help players decide what kind of game do they want to fit in. Do they want to play in a game that has no hierarchy and is just that kind of, we all follow the rules, or do they want a game with a strict storyteller and dungeon masters and things like that? So I think it's a really interesting distinction.
Yeah, and I would just want to say, if you are that kind of player, and everyone has different levels of social skills, but if you've been in the position of power and character several times or repeatedly, if you've been playing for a while, I would just say it can be just as rewarding to help other people, especially new players, try to achieve that, and to kind of shift yourself more towards a mentorship role.
Yeah,
so I would encourage anyone who finds themselves in that position to explore that idea.
Yeah, I think that can be a lot of fun, both as the player and as the character. There can be real area to explore as the character who wants to be the power behind the throne, not on the throne themselves, or just wants to be really in the background and not seeing what's happening at the street level instead of up on the throne. So, well, great, JP. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I'm really glad you could be a part of it. If people want to kind of know more about you, is there ways they can follow your writings or places you're active?
I do not have anything in particular at this time, but maybe there are some things in the works.
Cool.
So perhaps in the future you could post something up as a follow-up or something.
Sounds good. I totally will. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this. To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Would love to hear your stories. How has LARPing or role-playing been for you? What are some great ethical questions you faced in character, and how did you resolve them? Or what are some times you've had to wrestle with things in game? You can email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at superheroethics, or you can post on the Facebook page, Superhero Ethics at Facebook. All those are great ways. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your ideas, thoughts on this episode, thoughts on an episode you want us to do in the future. Please let us know. JP, thanks again to you. And to everyone, thanks again for tuning in. We'll be back soon. Bye-bye.